In this discussion of motivation, we're going to be talking about what characteristics the job brings to people's motivation. Jobs range all the way from sweeping floors to building rockets, and we really don't know how much those two kinds of jobs have in common ultimately. What we want to think about today is their motivating potential. That is, how is it that we can motivate people in any job? Some jobs, of course, have much more motivation built into them, and that's something that we need to consider. So beyond basic theory that we've talked about already, we also want to think about the nature of the work. And if we're motivating innovative work, we can count on a fair amount of what we call intrinsic motivation to drive people's behavior. There's a clip that's posted for you, Dan Pink talking about motivation. Keep in mind he's talking about very specific kinds of jobs, and not all jobs have these intrinsic qualities. So we need to be careful to make sure we're not generalizing in a very sort of specific way from everything he has to say. That clip is posted, the link to it is posted on Blackboard. Today, we're going to be talking a lot more about jobs that perhaps we have to tinker with to get them to be motivating at all. So our approach to job design tends to come from three different fundamental approaches. We can think about efficiency. It would be based in Taylorism or scientific management, where we break down the work into very small parts and we can interchange people and parts very quickly. And the focus is all on making the job much more efficient. That is, we use fewer inputs, of course, and get more outputs. We also have job design approaches that come from empowerment theory, and that's primarily what we're going to talk about today. As you might guess, it fits best with, of course, in leadership and organizational behavior. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. And then, of course, more recently, quality and constant redesign types of approaches and processes are ways that we can redesign as well. These tend to focus on re-engineering, a constant look at how we could continue to improve, and aren't quite as involved with the people aspect, or more involved with how do we get the people's input, the employees' input into making the job work better for the outcomes that we want. In many cases, it's customers, what customers want in terms of quality and how we can produce that efficiently. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the empowerment approach. Two key terms that we might want to be familiar with: job enlargement and job enrichment. Both of them are thought to be somewhat motivating, and if you spend much time in manufacturing facilities, you can see job enlargement is alive and well. We give people a number of tasks, and they have some variety, but they are typically essentially at the same level, and that means that people get to change what they're doing from time to time and use different skills to some extent. Their jobs get bigger, but they don't necessarily provide more empowerment. They just provide some variety so people don't get quite as bored as they do under a strictly scientific management or Taylorist type of approach. Job enrichment actually adds jobs both above and below the current level of the job to give people a feeling of more completeness, and that's what we're going to talk about in more depth. The job characteristics model is a classic approach to the empowerment perspective, and probably the most used one, and it really explains how to enrich jobs and how to make them more interesting and intrinsically motivating to people. So if you think you have a job that could be driven by intrinsic motivation, one of the things if you want to do, if your job is not really characterized by intrinsic motivation, is to think about how you might redesign it so that it can create that for people. So here's the basic model. The core job dimensions, which we'll define in a minute, lead to psychological states which lead to specific outcomes. So job dimensions are ways that we can characterize the job. Is it particularly characterized by variety or autonomy? Those dimensions lead to people's internal feelings about what's going on with the job, the psychological states, and ultimately to outcomes such as job satisfaction, the quality of the work, and so on. There's also some factors that act as context or interacting factors. So these situational contingencies, or here they're characterized as interaction factors, are going to determine whether your job characteristics model is a good idea in your setting. So we need to pay a lot of attention to what's going on with those, which we'll do in just a moment. So let's define our job characteristics. Does the job have significant variety? Do people only screw one bolt on one fender, or do they get to do a variety of things? This might incorporate job rotation, skill rotation programs where people have to be cross-trained and then they can work a number of different positions. Gives them some variety. It doesn't generally give them huge amounts of different levels of power in the structure. That is, they typically are at the same level. Task identity, however, brings that element of giving people a whole piece of work. So if I start at the beginning and I get to the end and I can say, this is something that I created, people have more feeling of identity with that task. So a simple example would be giving an administrative assistant a typing task. That would be low identity because the person is only just typing something up. They don't know what it's for. They don't really know when it's finished. They don't necessarily edit it. Or giving them the whole idea, that is, here's a rough document. Here's what it's for. I want you to shape this up, and I'm going to give you the edits when we go around on it, revising it again. So that would give me more task identity because I know where my product is going. I see it earlier in the process, and hopefully I'm the person who sort of finishes it off. So task identity is important for that sense of I can relate to my work because I know my customer and I know what I'm doing. I know where it goes after this. I know where it came from. Significance also adds that meaning component. So is my job significant? Well, a lot of us think about our jobs as being very significant. So if you recently having been in a plant that made huge water pipes, their idea of significance there is, well, we are creating the opportunity to for communities to have clean water and to replace and renovate their water systems. That's always going to be important. That's always going to be important. People in the energy industry, nuclear power, any kind of power, people think of that as being extremely significant. We depend on energy for our lifestyle. And needless to say, if there's a problem with getting the energy we want or paying for the energy we want, we're not going to be happy. We can think of jobs that don't have significance, right? Or that it's harder to build significance into. So if my job is to eyeball the potato chips as they come down the assembly line and knock off the ones that are a little too misshapen or a little too dark or a little too white, then of course I really have to love potato chips to think that that's a tremendously significant job. So it probably isn't something that we can build into everything. Autonomy. I get to make some of the choices around my work fairly clearly. That's going to be intrinsically motivating because it comes back on me. And feedback. I need to know how I'm doing. If my job doesn't give me any of that, then it doesn't really matter what I do. So going back to the example of the administrative assistant or the person looking at the potato chips, if I don't get any feedback about what's going on with my process, then it really doesn't matter to me. This was a classic way that the automotive industry back in the 1970s went wrong. They had assembly lines, and then they had other assembly lines that fixed the work of the original assembly lines, and the original assembly lines didn't get any feedback about that. So these are the characteristics of the job that lead to experiences of meaningfulness. My job is meaningful. Experiences of responsibility. I have to take responsibility for my work and doing it well, and a knowledge of results. I know how my work is coming out. So what do I expect to get from these? Well, internal work motivation, that intrinsic motivation we've been talking about. The quality of performance tends to go up, not the quantity, but the quality. Satisfaction and less absenteeism and turnover. So these are some pretty good outcomes, but if what you really wanted to do, of course, is improve the quantity of performance, it wouldn't be a good idea, right? Here's some other characteristics that might determine whether or not you think this is a thing to do in your company. Growth needs. Do the employees really want a bigger job that gives them more task significance or meaningfulness or autonomy? If people don't want autonomy, it's probably a mistake to give it to them. The context satisfaction, such as I feel okay with my pay and my security, job security, and my coworkers, if those are really bad, this is going back to the example of the boss that hands out an appreciation form. If I'm mad about my pay, don't give me a bigger job. Don't give me recognition. Do something to fix the things that I'm angry about that are really important to me. So those context satisfactions, if they're low, we probably don't want to implement this model. And lastly, we need some level of skill and knowledge for the workers, because we're going to ask them to make more decisions through autonomy. We're going to ask them to use feedback. We're going to ask them to do more than they used to do. And that means that they really need to have skills that perhaps the lowest level of the organization doesn't necessarily always have. If your workers don't have those knowledge and skills, you don't want to jump into a job design process. What you want to do is some remedial training initially, whether it's computer training or quantitative literacy training and so on, before you do the job redesign, because otherwise, of course, the job redesign will fail.